Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. ENO is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank that shapes public debate on critical multimodal transportation issues and builds an innovative network of transportation professionals. My name is Ramik Avaz, and I'm a policy analyst here at ENO. Today, we're hosting a panel discussion about the role and future of complete streets post-COVID with Dave Ederer, Christian Gutierrez, and Jana Lina. Dave recently completed his PhD in Transportation Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech in the Urban Transformation Information Lab. His research is focused on how we can better use urban space to build healthier and more livable cities. Christian is the Chief Revenue Officer at Passport and also serves as co-sponsor to Passport's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Jana is a Senior Policy Advisor with the Aarp Public Policy Institute, where she works on a broad array of planning and policy issues, including safe streets, public transportation, data standards to support new mobility, and the travel patterns of older adults. You can enter questions in the box on the side of your screen at any time, and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A at towards the end of this webinar. While we don't expect any tech issues, we found that exiting and rejoining the webinar tends to help any minor issues that come up for individual listeners. ENO is happy to offer our webinar series free of charge. And if you enjoy our webinars and are interested in supporting ENO's work, you can check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. You can also find slides and a recording of this webinar on our website, enotrans.org, and the recording will also be mailed to all registrants within the next day. And with that, we'll start off with a broad discussion and some reflections on the pandemic and its impact on street use. Of course, the pandemic's prompted many of us to think more critically about how people interact with their neighborhoods. A lot of cities have implemented pilot programs for slow streets, complete streets, outdoor dining, and have found creative ways to retool and reorient the form and function of their public roadways. So looking back on the past year, how has COVID-19 affected the way communities approach the design and purpose of public streets, and what notable complete streets initiatives have you observed and or worked on through your organizations? And to start off, Jana, feel free to go ahead. Jana, I think you're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
So Ramik and thank you so much for having me join the webinar today. This is a really interesting time. In terms of what I've observed with streets, even in my own community where I live, Arlington, Virginia, my street got a new bike lane this past year. It was a project that had been started. It really was pushed by the neighborhood or a neighboring neighborhood. And that idea went into testing mode a couple of years ago, and then it gave us the opportunity to expand the corridor to having a bike lane. And so that was exciting. And I think we've seen that happen in a number of communities around the United States. COVID has really given us an opportunity to reimagine how we use our public streets and public spaces. Commute patterns have changed. And so we are able to try things that we've been talking about for a long time in transportation circles. And so that's very exciting. AARP, as an organization, we did a special series. We teamed up with Main Street America to produce a number of fact sheets and videos on topics such as open streets, parks and parklets and pedlets, other public amenities and trails and parks. And this is really a continuation of work that we've been doing now for more than about 15 years. We were one of the founding steering committee members of the National Complete Streets Coalition. We've been working through our state offices and federal advocacy folks to really push the passage of complete streets and Vision Zero policies across the United States. And more recently, we've been supporting our state offices through both technical assistance from individuals like myself, from our national office, but we also have a team of nonprofits and contractors who we help set up with our state offices in order to provide them with more technical assistance to do this kind of work out in the field. So, thank you.
Christian, if you want to go next.
Yeah, thanks, Ramik. I'll jump right in there. I couldn't agree more with Jana's commentary. it's given folks a huge opportunity to think differently about how they might approach their programs, certainly on the local level. But something that's been exciting to our work at Passport is seeing communities collaborate, in sort of this new world that we're living in, or this new, sense of normalcy that's been building, right? This has been in industry, parking, transportation, mobility, very hands-on, trade show oriented. Now we're all, at home, and one thing that's really neat is being able to get municipal leaders together, brainstorming and talking about some of these things that have changed so rapidly in the years leading up to 2020, and then certainly, of course, the pandemic. And so, broadly, COVID made on-demand delivery skyrocket, for one, and DoorDash, Uber Eats, Amazon. I probably have too many boxes from Amazon Prime sitting in my recycling now. So the on-demand gig economy boomed from COVID. So we noticed that our curbs became more dynamic. Vehicles would only be parked on a curb for 2 minutes, right, or would block bike lanes, while dropping off food, right? These sorts of things became even more commonplace than they were in the past. And as we talked to cities, 2 really jumped out and came to mind. But I'll say broadly, out of America's 100 largest cities by population, 91 of them took action to protect business stability by repurposing public space to allow outdoor retail and dining. You may have heard about this idea of parklets, where they sort of turn, painted lines, parking spaces into opportunities to dine outside, or, spend time with friends and family. We actually see legislation out in SF right now, with a piece of legislation introduced by Mayor Breed that would allow parklets built by restaurants and bars to become permanent. And we're headquartered in Charlotte. Right down the road from us is Raleigh. And in Raleigh, in March 2020, they moved super swiftly in order to start a temporary curbside pickup zone program, creating short-term spots for cars to make quick stops at local businesses that have limited storefront access. And due to the overwhelming success over the last year, they plan to continue this, even, sort of as we have some of the tailwinds coming out of the pandemic. So, I do think that these innovations create both challenges and opportunities, right, for cities looking to deliver efficient, sustainable, and equitable public spaces. And technology and data will be critical in ensuring that complete streets are here to stay.
So I guess I'll pick up off where Jana and Christian left. So for me, I think it's important to kind of set the framework for what complete streets are. What does complete streets mean? And there's a great article from Barbara McCann from 2008. It says, complete streets, we can get there from here. And if you read it, it says that complete streets isn't about a single project. And you hear about complete streets projects in every city, wherever you are in the United States. And that's great, but I think we kind of missed the point there. Complete streets is about completely redefining how we think about transportation and what we do in transportation. And I think the pandemic, that massive decrease in traffic, it's allowed people to see how we've built our roadways. And I do a lot of research on vehicle speeds and using cell phone data to estimate risk, but and I see that data every day, right? I can see that we've primarily defined the function of our streets in terms of vehicle speed and throughput, and that's what they do. And most people don't see that from the seat of their car, walking around town, sitting on a transit bus. But now that we lost all the traffic, everybody has seen in real time this massive increase in vehicle speeds and massive decrease in vehicle miles traveled, and actually an increase in the number of deaths. And that really kind of goes back to the theme of the webinar, is that we've defined our function in terms of basically one thing, and that's vehicle throughput. And that's resulted in a kind of misapplication of what our roadways should be. And I think people have seen that in real time. A really good example, because I know Ramak asked for some good initiatives that people have worked on. I really love the work in Salt Lake City. Actually, they're doing something to redefine the function of their streets by defining new street topologies. Right now, we use one metric to define the function of our streets, and that's vehicle throughput. And so we only have 3 ways of describing our streets within cities: arterials, collectors, and local roads. and it's defined basically on that vehicle throughput. Salt Lake has done a lot of cool work to engage with the community, rethink how they do business, and redefine the purpose of our streets. And they've done that throughout the pandemic, and I think it was an interesting time to do so as people have that kind of in the front of their mind.
Thanks, Dave. So both the pandemic, looking back on the past year, and of course the national conversation about policing, racial justice, and the way we think about traffic safety and traffic enforcement have only reinforced the importance of transportation planning, outcomes, and thinking really critically about who our streets serve, who these pilots serve, and thinking through very consciously about the communities that we listen to and respond to in our transportation planning. As all of you have worked on these initiatives and researched street design and function through various angles, what are some of the most important planning, design, and/or data considerations to ensure equitable planning and implementation of complete streets initiatives, or even just whole-scale approaches to the way we think about our street planning?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in there, Ramik. So we know there are disparities in transportation access for lower income communities and communities of color. When we think about designing our streets, often our most innovative and creative ideas tend to be concentrated in more affluent areas or economic centers of town. And we sort of see this all around the country. At Passport, we had a unique opportunity to run a few pilot programs, one in Charlotte, one in Omaha, one in Detroit, related to the micromobility programs that had rolled out. So just sort of zooming in on our work with Charlotte, we worked with them to launch this micromobility pilot program that focused on distributing scooters across the city based on city zoning and equity goals. So the program was unique in that what it did was it charged micromobility providers, operators like Bird, Lime, Spin, dynamic parking fees based on where scooters were parked in the city and for how long they sit blocking essential areas such as handicap ramps or sidewalks. The biggest goal for the city in our work in this project was redistribution to communities that had less access to scooters, right? Think first and last mile, and also ensuring, again, broadly, that scooters weren't parked irresponsibly, blocking handicapped ramps, blocking sidewalks, being sort of hoisted and thrown into a park, right? So ensuring that Charlotte's complete street policies are upheld by scooter companies. So really fundamentally changing the approach of how municipalities could sort of think about working with fleet systems like this. So as we design complete streets friendly products, it's important to continuously ask ourselves the following, right? Will certain groups have a harder time accessing the benefits to this technology? Where are the access gaps? We spend a lot of time talking about underbanked, unbanked, right? How can we leverage community input to ensure that planning takes into consideration historically disenfranchised groups, right? So once we design technology that can appropriately answer these types of questions, these questions specifically, we can create a more equitable transportation system.
So Christian, I'm so glad that you are doing that work. From our members at AARP, we hear over and over again the frustration with scooters blocking sidewalks, really posing a tripping hazard. And for older adults, it can be really a life-altering situation. If someone goes down and ends up in the hospital, it can actually lead to death. It's something that affects frail older adults much more so than younger users of the sidewalk realm. And it's really interesting to hear how technology is coming to play to help regulate some of that street and sidewalk realm in order to help meet these social goals. The one thing I wanted to bring up as part of an answer to this question is the importance of context in the work that we do. And I want to just share an illustrative story of some work that I've done in the past year or two that really opened my eyes to thinking a little differently about how I go about the work on this topic. So in 2019, toward the end of 2019, I participated in a panel and walk audit through the American Public Health Association's Disability Committee that at their conference. And so we had teamed up a number of professionals like myself who were planners and designers, as well as with advocates in the community, many of whom had disabilities. And we took a walk audit of downtown Philadelphia. And there was one particular plaza in the Civic Core, and it had a statue in that plaza. And when we were doing that walk audit, I just walked right by the statue. I didn't give it a second thought. And I was looking at, are there curb cuts? Are there edge lines for people to cane? What's the contrast sensitivity and the coloring on the steps, et cetera? And we came back, we debriefed that, and I think all of us learned a lot from the disability community as to what they were seeing and experiencing in that network. Well, a year later, in 2020, this was after COVID hit and after the Black Lives Matter protests really had erupted across the United States, that we were asked to come as a group of panelists to come back and do the webinar, but as a virtual session. And this time, redefine equity to be beyond just what for people with disabilities, but to include racial justice, gender, all of those intersectionality aspects of justice and equity. And it was at that point that some of the advocates who had participated pointed out that that statue of a former mayor and former police commissioner was actually considered very offensive and very threatening to many Black people in the community, just because of that individual's record with police brutality and many other racist comments and practices. And so, there's I forget what her name is. I think it's Setha Lowe, who's with the Public Space Research Group. She actually put out a framework of justice, and there's different elements of justice that we need to be considering. There's distributive justice, for instance, who has access to the street, park, or trail, but then also interactional justice. What makes people feel welcome or unwanted in space? And so I think as professionals working in this space, at least myself as a white woman and city planner, that I was not aware enough and did not put enough emphasis on that aspect of justice. And so something that I just really encourage all of us to be thinking about as we move forward.
Thanks, Jenna. Actually, that you're ending on interactional justice. I'm really glad, because that's actually what I've been thinking about in terms of engagement and equity during the pandemic. And I go back to actually that Salt Lake City project on defining street topologies, because that wasn't connected to any project. And again, Complete Streets isn't about a single project. There's no one complete street. It's about changing fundamentally how we do things. And what they did in Salt Lake is they didn't connect it to a project. They went out to the community. They engaged for years at a time and asked folks what they want their streets to be. How do you want them to function? And what should the form look like that? And it goes back to your point about context, because that's what it's all about. If we only work one project at a time, we're not really thinking about context. And we're not creating context. We're not using that context to define how our streets should work. And one thing I hope to see more in the future is getting away from project-based engagement and having that engagement that's just all the time. There's a really good example of it here in the city of Atlanta. We had something called Atlanta City Studio. So instead of working, downtown at City Hall, planners set up shop for months at a time in a community, and people just come in, they have coffee, they talk to the planners, and people get a better idea of that context and a better idea of what people want their streets to be. So I wanted to hit that point on engagement. I also wanted to talk about enforcement really quickly. Again, people have noticed just how fast people are willing to drive on our streets. They've also noticed that our current enforcement system is broken. It doesn't deter speeding, and it frequently results in people dying, and specifically Black people dying. Right? That's not good for the community. It's not good for anyone. So people are increasingly interested in automated enforcement. I think we need to be really careful with how we do that. And the best automated enforcement system hands out 0 tickets because everybody's driving the speed limit, right? So we got to stop justifying it in terms of generating revenue. We have to think about it in terms of safety. Set up networks of speed cameras, tell people where they are, put them in Google Maps. You want people to slow down. It's not about generating revenue. It's about saving lives, both in terms of preventing those high speeds, but also preventing those adverse interactions with law enforcement that aren't necessary.
Thanks everyone. So in the last 10 or so minutes we have before we open up our discussion to panel our audience questions, I want to shift a conversation, kind of thinking about what's on the horizon. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about the future of travel behavior after the pandemic. There's cautious optimism about the pandemic recovery as vaccine rollouts accelerate. There's questions about the permanence of different pilots that we've done in cities across the country, and of course the transportation priorities of the new administration. So with all of this in mind, I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on how you think the road ahead looks like for complete streets policies at the local level, and what opportunities might exist for federal action and partnerships in this realm from the new administration and the new leadership at DOT.
I can start there real quick. So last week, the secretary said something that got me really, really excited. And he said, transportation policy is public health policy. I consider myself a public health professional. Before I was an engineer, I was working in public health. I'm actually going back into public health. I'll start back at CDC again in July. And what I really appreciate from this administration, and specifically at the federal level, is the recognition that transportation is a problem of healthcare access, like people getting to their doctor's appointments, whatever it might be. Also, an issue of public health outcomes in terms of injuries, crashes, and deaths, but also all those things that are comorbidities for things like COVID, right? If you have, if you're overweight, if you are exposed to lots of noxious particulate matter, it puts you at a higher risk for lots of infectious diseases. And I think there's a recognition of that at the federal level, that these two things are one and the same. And I hope that more transportation engineers view themselves as public health professionals. I certainly do, and I want them to think like public health professionals. And I think they can do so at the local level by adopting the principles that really underlie complete streets policies and Vision Zero, because in my opinion, those are public health policies. They're about prevention. They're about preventing things at the systems level, and they're also about saving lives. And that's core public health. And I'm excited that people know what the word epidemiology means. I'm disappointed in why they probably learned it, but I hope to see more transportation professionals think like epidemiologists and apply those public health ideas that they're learning about. So that's a hope. Maybe that's aspirational. I'm not sure that's what's going to happen.
Well, I'm optimistic as well with the new administration, and I think another way that these policies show up is in helping to combat climate change. And that's certainly something this administration has shown it's very interested in digging deep and trying to make some major changes with our transportation policies to reduce carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. The one cautionary that I have at the federal level is that I think there are some who might try to simplify transportation's role in combating climate change down to just the electrification of our vehicle fleet. And we really need to make sure that we're pushing much broader type of transformation, investment in public transportation, investment in active transportation, because there are so many benefits out there through new ways of traveling. And then at the local and state levels, I'm actually really see great opportunity here. One of the tools that AARP Public Policy Institute puts out, a project of mine, is our AARP Livability Index, and where we track 60 indicators of livability across 7 categories, and transportation being one of those. And so we've been tracking the passage of complete streets policies since 2015. And our last update, we definitely saw quite a lot of activity at the local level in passage of these policies, particularly among the Midwest and the South. And so it seems that, you know, sometimes those more conservative parts of the country are not at the forefront of this, but I think even those areas of the country are coming along, and you know, local advocates are really having some success in changing things up. So hopefully we'll continue to see that moving forward.
Yeah, and Jana, we've seen, you know, some exciting things come out of the Midwest as it relates to this exact topic. I mean, back in 2016, the Smart Mobility Hub project in Columbus, Ohio, $50 million worth of grants from the U.S. DOT, and I think you know, the moment's here, right? I think at the end of the day, there's still a high degree of uncertainty about how COVID-19 will shape, you know, street design in the long run. But we've learned over the last year that cities are wanting to build safe streets that create more livable space for bikers, pedestrians, buses. I mean, we've seen it in force, and I think we've all brought up wonderful examples throughout this conversation. I think what we're seeing now is cities are experimenting with what complete street policy could look like long term. You know, once, you know, do these pilots continue, right? Or as Dave said, it's not one single project, but you know, how do we continue to advance these initiatives? So I think our key question is what happens to these pilot programs once travel behavior resumes to normal levels, right? This is where the real opportunity is for federal government to lean in. So I think, you know, from the city side, we consistently hear that they do not have the funding nor the data to implement long-term changes, and to boot, you know, the revenue shortfalls from the pandemic, really all around mobility and transportation broadly. So I think that the US DOT is led by folks with municipal backgrounds and expertise, and Secretary Buttigieg has articulated interest in making city street level design a priority. The opportunity here is for federal and local to collaborate, to provide the funding needed to support long-term changes. Beyond pilot programs often funded by companies themselves, cities need permanent infrastructure, back-end tools, data collection opportunities, aggregated and anonymized, of course, and policies, ultimately. There's a real opportunity here for federal government to support these efforts. So, you know, we know from data that complete streets work. Complete streets have been associated with increased employment, property values, and new businesses. You know, the more that we can drive this message home at the federal and local levels, I think we'll see that lasting long-term change.
Thanks, Christian. Go ahead, Jana.
If I can just put out a little plug for AARP's Community Challenge Grants. These are another opportunity for funding a very small amount of money compared to what the federal government can come up with, but they really fund those quick action pop-up placemaking type of projects. And those applications are due on April 14th. So anyone out there listening, if you have a project that's ready to go and you just need to demonstrate how this can work and benefit a community, that might be another possible source of funding.
Thanks, Shana. So in the about 15 or so minutes that we have left, I want to open the floor to audience questions, and everyone feel free to continue to send in questions in the questions box on the control panel on the side of your screen. So to start off, we have one question here, and Dave, this gets back to your point about, you know, Complete Streets not being one individual project or a pilot, but, you know, a broader focus and mentality in terms of how we think of streets. And so we had one audience member ask, you know, how do we help cities make big changes for safety around streets and sidewalk design and land use when, you know, pilot programs or smaller, less expensive and more politically feasible projects that, you know, could show us easy wins are relatively easy to do. You know, how do we incentivize policymakers to implement some of these changes that might be harder than a small pilot project or a parklet conversion?
That's a tough question. If it were easy, we'd have done it already, right? You change the rule book, right? You change that that set of standards and guidelines that engineers go back to. And there's an opportunity to do it right now. The MUTCD is out for public comment. There's some great resources from people like APBP, Leave American Bicyclists that are explaining what the MUTCD is. Just to give you a quick explanation, it's the book that engineers rely on that sets their signs and standards and tells them what they can and can't do or what they feel comfortable doing or not. It's really hard to comment on that, but Google MUTCD and revisions, look it up, get engaged. But really, frankly, that's a call to my fellow engineers and planners to get engaged with that process, because you're the people who are going to change it. And we can't actually put it on the public or just advocates to change those things. If you're a professional in this field, you need to be engaged with those things that set the context, as Janice said, that we can go beyond just single pilot projects and redefining what our defaults are. And I go back to that Salt Lake project. That's what they did. They redefining functional class, I think, is a conversation we need to have. That doesn't mean changing the federal aid highway functional classification system, but in your city, you can define street use types based on land use context and a number of other things. They've done it in Salt Lake. They've done it in the entire state of Florida. Florida DOT has a context-sensitive design guide for its streets. So this is something we can do and we should do, and that's how you get that big long-term change.
And Dave, do you have like a top 3 of what you would like to see most changed in the MUTCD that advocates might?
Oh my goodness!
I don't know. And you talked about context-sensitive design, or the classification system. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Oh man, I should have had a top 3 ready.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. This is going to sound really kind of boring. Pedestrian crossing islands. I would love to see a better definition of where we can put pedestrian crossing islands. Rethinking where and when we use two-way left turn lanes. They use a lot of space on arterials, and they're primarily to decrease vehicle delay, regardless of whether we need those turning lanes present. Geez, what would a third one be? Mid-block crossings are another big one. I'd love to see some more clear, better guidance on where and when we can have mid-block crossings, because that's a game changer for folks. Having to walk half a mile to cross the street legally is just crazy, and that's a direct result of stuff in the MUTCD. I'm sure people are going to correct me on Twitter or something after I gave those answers, and they should. I hope they do.
Moving on to another question, I'll send Christian, and if you're about to chime in,
this idea, it's just of changing the rule book. I just feel compelled to say that, last year we did see really interesting purchasing behavior from municipalities. Broadly, municipalities just were more willing and able to jump in and try some new things, do A/B testing, some things that we see, more broadly in the private space. So I think, whether it's, this idea of emergency purchase vehicles or similar, or even collective purchasing mechanisms. We talked earlier about cities talking to each other, right? As proof becomes, more and more evident through the data that shared streets work. I think there are public health benefits, economic benefits, connecting people more accessibly to jobs, and as we can sort of spin the flywheel, right, and people see this a lot more, I think that we'll start to sort of see an increasing slope, in velocity of change, sweeping change.
And I would also just add one more recommendation to the elements of change, and that's stakeholder outreach. You know, one of the things that we've been able to use very successfully in getting complete streets policies passed and really start to make change at the local level is doing these, you know, walk audits, engaging local community members. You know, you get the elected officials there, you get the press there, and you have enough diversity in the stakeholders you bring to the table that represent different interests. And we've really managed to make quite a lot of inroads in that regard as well. So that stakeholder outreach is always really, really essential.
Got it. Thanks, Jana. We've gotten a handful, if not more, questions talking about, you know, a lot of these, the conversation and focus on complete streets, you know, seem to be focused on, you know, a city or CBD context. And there's been a lot of interest in, you know, how do we promote the same in suburban and even rural contexts? You know, of course, pedestrian and cyclist safety, and of course, priority for transit is important in these areas as well. And so it'd be great if you could talk through, you know, how do we promote the same shift and think about complete streets, not just in the heart of our cities where active modes of transportation might be more prevalent, but also in suburban, exurban, rural communities.
Well, I can maybe start just, you know, one example in rural Vermont. Bethel, Vermont had a kind of your standard 2-lane county road going through, and it had truck traffic, had fairly high speeds right down through downtown Main Street. And they were able to really help shift some of the mindset of how that street could be treated differently through a pop-up project where they restriped the street, added bike lanes, they did these, you know, they removed some of the parking spaces and did outdoor seating and really activated the Main Street buildings. There were a couple of vacant buildings that they turned into pop-up vendor stalls for arts and crafts, and it just transformed literally overnight what that street looked like and how it performed. And in that type of pop-up element can start to help lead to a more permanent change in communities. So I think complete streets, it's as appropriate for rural and suburban areas as it is for urban areas. And yeah, I don't want to spend too much airtime here, but we could go on.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, like you mentioned earlier, Jana, you know, it's much easier to design streets when you know the needs of the stakeholders we work with, right? So, you know, civil society groups, local businesses, transportation groups, getting the input is important. So, you know, while the solutions might look different, you know, across these communities, it's really just trying to understand, get a pulse of what's happening there and in these specific locales as well. What are the problems that they're dealing with and facing, right? So, you know, data and insights help identify and prioritize needs. Stakeholders, you know, include both folks in the city and civil society groups that interact with transportation. And without proper needs assessment, it's impossible to design streets that tailor the needs of a wider set of users, no matter the size of the environment.
Yeah, and that data piece is really important. So really track where are the pedestrians and bicyclists being, you know, having crashes with vehicles, who's getting hurt and where, and all of that is good important stuff to bring forward.
So we've gotten a couple questions too on the role of freight when we think about, you know, street design and complete streets. Of course, you know, Christian, you mentioned the rise of e-commerce during the pandemic, and one question in particular asked, you know, if anyone can shed light on programs for truck loading and unloading during COVID, you know, especially in instances where we had more limited curb space as a result of pop-up parklets, outdoor dining, et cetera. And, you know, what lessons have we learned, what worked and what didn't in terms of the way we manage city logistics and e-commerce as we, you know, think ahead to how we incorporate freight and trucking into, you know, our cities post-COVID?
Yeah, as it relates to you know, data, really like understanding the corners of this question, like peak times, for example. You know, we work with the city of Chicago. We work with a group called Chicago Parking Meters, right? There's 40,000 parking spaces there across the city on street where people, you know, you can pay for parking, you know, via mobile, you know, throughout the day. And one of the things that they were able to solve for before and then during the pandemic was to say, hey, on off-peak hours, this whole area, which during the day would be, you know, a paid parking space, is actually a delivery zone. And in fact, actually, we can rework the function of specific areas of town at even potentially peak hours as well, right? Just really trying to understand the flow that's coming through that environment. I think that's something that they were able to solve for with simple signage as well. So, you know, fairly low, you know, CapEx, getting up and running and providing, you know, a huge benefit for, you know, for these delivery groups and freight broadly.
Yeah, and DC had a pilot. I think it's ended at this point in time, but they had an app for freight drivers, truck drivers that were trying to serve the downtown business district. So they zoned the curb, and you could make an advance reservation that you need to park here for a 15 minutes time slot to load or unload. And then they made sure that there was ample space to get them out of the bike lane, get them over to the curb. I haven't actually seen the results of that study, but I think that's something to look at. It seems that there's a big opportunity for technology to help us in these regards of how to manage the curb space. I would say it was a big challenge. It's been a big challenge during COVID. It was very much a growing problem in many of our urban areas pre-COVID. I bike to DC as my bike commuter, and I would say the last 5 years, with the increasing growth of Uber and Lyft, that my bike commute got much more dangerous, even though DC was striping bike lanes. So I think it's a combination of technology fix as well as needing that design, that form, to ensure that we are accomplishing the function or the mission of our streets. And so we need to protect all road users and have space for the places that we need the different uses. It's very challenging.
And one really quick last point, beyond, you know, we have a good idea where freight networks occur and where pickups and drop-offs need to be, and increasingly with real-time data, super helpful for managing things in time. Another opportunity for the federal government is vehicle regs, right? And the design of our vehicles, and looking at how those what's right sizing our freight vehicles, because Complete Streets in the end is about right sizing our streets to match the form and function. We can do the same with vehicle design, right? You have a lot of different delivery vehicles that can work in an urban environment and aren't as obtrusive, and frankly can move through city streets faster. I'm not going to pretend I know how to do that, but I do know there's plenty of opportunities for places like NHTSA and their vehicle star ratings to change how vehicles are actually built and thus interact with other road users.
Well, we see some of those vehicles in the US, but more so in Europe, where they're smaller trucks and then they have the passenger door. It's basically the entire door is a window, so you have much fewer blind spots. And I'd love to see a lot more of those in the United States.
Well, we're just about out of time. We have tons of questions, but I think we're at a good stopping point. So thank you, of course, to everyone for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned, you'll be able to find slides and recording of the webinar on our website at enotrans.org, and it'll be emailed out to all of the registrants over the next day. Again, make sure to sign up for our mailing list to gain access to the free Connector newsletter, webinar announcements, report releases, and more. And if you enjoy our webinars and are interested in supporting our work, again, you can check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. And last but certainly not least, thank you again to Christian, Jada, and Dave for joining us, and to our audience for your participation and your outstanding questions. Make sure to sign up for our next webinar on bus electrification and workforce equity on April 13th, 2021. So thank you again, everyone, and hope everyone has a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.